Let's talk about interactive narratives, because I think we're doing it wrong. Whenever we create a narrative for our game, we always seem to want to create a movie style or TV style narrative. Structurally speaking, I mean, it might branch or whatever, but it still unfolds like a movie or TV narrative. And I don't think that's working out very well for us. I think we need to figure out a way to make it actually a game-centric style. We don't make our video game levels look like movie sets, so why are we trying to make our narratives look like movie narratives? Let's go ahead and give some examples. Detroit, Become Human. I hated it. But here's the thing. I hated it for the exact same reasons I hate every Quantic Dream style adventure game. I love the beginning, and then it goes to crap, and I always have the exact same complaints where I rail about the writer using the exact same terms, and I say things like, is this a fan fiction by some kid who did not understand this classic work of science fiction? Why is this so bad? Why are all the themes so screwed up? Why is the pacing so crap? Why is this dialogue so wooden? What's wrong with these writers? But Detroit Become Human isn't a Quantic Dream game, and it's not by the Quantic Dream people. And it cost $40 million. And I have the exact same complaints about the writing. That seems pretty unlikely. Maybe it's not the writing that's the problem. Maybe it's the Quantic Dream style that's the problem. So I watched some Let's Plays, and, the game wasn't bad when I watched it via Let's Play. The parts I hated, I no longer hated. The parts I loved, I no longer loved. So what's going on here? Well, I think the only difference between the people who liked Detroit Become Human and the people who didn't like Detroit Become Human is whether or not these movie-style techniques work on them while they're playing the game. For me, they don't. For me, when I'm playing the game, the movie-style techniques don't work. The cutscenes, they don't take the cop show blocking for the levels. Doesn't feel right. It just all falls flat. And that leaves me with no investment, so I can just make fun of the story when it pops up instead of actually being in the story. Let's give you an example. There is a scene where you are attacked by mostly naked lesbian hookers. And I didn't really remember it. I mean, I remember that it sort of existed, but I didn't really remember it being anything other than a fight. So when I watched the Let's Plays, and I realized that it was roughly 10 minutes of groping around on the ground with mostly naked lesbians, I was like, you think I would have remembered that? Why do I just remember it as a generic fight? Well, because I was focused on pressing X as fast as possible, and then pressing A as fast as possible, and then choosing between left trigger and right trigger as fast as possible, and then pressing X as fast as possible, and then pressing A as fast as possible. Those QuickTime events are the gameplay, and they get me pumped. I like getting challenged, and I like overcoming those challenges. That's part of the reason that I play games. So when the QuickTime events were over, my question for the game was, how'd I do? Did I get 100% on that QuickTime event? And the game said, oh, here is the story of these two sad little robot hookers. And I was like, I'm not really interested in the two sad little robot hookers. And the game was like, but their story is so long and slow. And I was like, oh God, this is so boring. Look at this, I've seen better lip sync on a dog. No, there's nothing wrong with lip sync. The story isn't boring. It's not even that long. The problem is that I wasn't invested. And this is how it always is. There is no piece of media that is not flawed. Every piece of media has plot holes, pacing issues, technical problems. Nothing is perfect. But the real test of a director or a writer or a game dev is whether or not they can pin you to the ground while you're playing the game so that you don't notice those flaws. Are you so invested that those flaws just slide right by? And for me, the answer while playing Detroit Human was no. But while watching Detroit Human, the answer was yes. The movie style did not work on me because I was not there for the movie. I was there for the game. And we talk about ludonarrative dissonance sometimes, but really what I would like to talk about is if the game and the narrative are separate, then I'm going to take the game. And I'm not going to have anything good to say about the narrative because I don't care. For someone that loves narrative-centric games, this is obviously an issue. Most of my favorite games are games where the narrative is really, really good. But I can only feel that when the gameplay isn't actively pulling me away from the narrative, isn't actively making me think of something else. It's not like pressing X to knock over a cart is ludonarratively dissonant with the story that's unfolding. It's that pressing X is fundamentally an action on the mouse pad that I want to do, or an action on the controller that I want to do, and it's not in the game world. So let's talk about the difference between these sorts of interactions, because what do I want out of my interactive narrative if it's not press X to progress the narrative, if it's not QuickTime events, if it's not, walking through a level and then a scene happens, if that is not going to be good enough, what is going to be good enough? Well, I love Quantic Dream style adventure games for the first bit, and that includes Detroit Become Human. If Detroit Become Human had been Detroit Become Housekeeper, I probably would have played it forever. And I know that I probably would have played it forever because I played House Flipper for 40 hours, and that is the kind of game I like. I like fixing things and learning things and progressing through things and making things happier and better. So I like pressing X to bake a cake. I like pressing X to fix a stove. I like pressing X to help someone with their homework. These are things that I enjoy. They're part of being in that world. This is the interactive narrative. And I know that sounds really dumb, right? Because this is the part of the game that's supposed to be boring. This is the part of the game that is supposed to ground you in the unending doldrums of a robot's life. But these are the parts that are good. These are the parts that interact in a way that gets me to feel them. And if you think about that, that's an interesting difference, because fundamentally, pressing X to bake a cake and pressing X to knock over a cart are the same, right? But why does one of them make the game worse, in my opinion, and one of them make the game better? Is it the time limit? Well, not exactly. There are games with time limits that are fine, like Life is Strange. So what about it is different? Well, the problem is that when the narrative is telling me to push X, that's the narrative telling me to push X. That's not a game. That is a movie where I have to press a button on the controller to keep it playing. Whereas when I'm wandering through the level and I see press X to fix a stove, that's me choosing to fix a stove. It's not even me choosing to press X, because by the time it pops up for the third time in the game, I'll already remember that X is what I do to do things. It'll just be a natural click. It'll be me interacting with the world to progress the world, to move through the world, rather than the narrative telling me to do something. Let's give an easier example, and a much more fundamental and basic one. There are plenty of these open world games, I'm blanking on the name all of a sudden, Grand Theft Auto style games. And in the beginning, the way they worked, well, once they had a story, you would walk up to a story point and your story would begin. You'd get your cutscene, you'd get your quest. But shortly after that, people decided that that was a little bit jarring and that the players didn't really get invested in the story when it just kind of popped into existence like that. So they created glowy circles on the ground. And if you walked into the glowy circle on the ground, the story would begin. And that was much, much better. But then they realized that it might be even better if you walk into the circle and then you have to press X to start the story. And that was even better. Like, I'm not putting words in their mouth. I'm being like, literally, that is better. It gives the player more investment when they press X to start the story, even if the story is exactly the same. This implies that the most important part of the interactive narrative is how you start it, like how you let the player start it. Pressing X is so much more powerful than just walking up to something. Even if the actual narrative is exactly the same, the way I experience it is much, much better because I'm invested in it if I press X to start it. Just like I'm invested in baking a cake if I press X to bake it. But I'm not invested in a fight scene if it tells me to press X to progress the fight scene. Now, if I was allowed to wander around the fight scene and, press X to punch whatever I wanted, then that would be invested again, because that would be gameplay again. I would be in that world again. But that's not how these games are built. So that's not an opportunity. It's not something that can be done without turning it into another kind of game. So the end result here is that the part of the interactive narrative that matters is the part where you press X to start it. And that's really quite strange, because no matter how good your narrative is, if I don't press X to start it, I'm not invested in it and I'll tear it apart. No matter how bad your narrative is, if I press X to start it, I'm invested and I won't notice how bad it is. We should be taking advantage of this. This is something that we should be putting a lot of effort into. When we talk about interactive narratives, we often talk about like branching paths and stuff, but we never talk about how do we make the narrative actually pull the player in an interactive sense. We always say, just use movie techniques. Use lighting here. Use a camera zoom here. Use a dialogue element here. No. This is an interactive medium. What is the interaction that draws the player into the game? And how does that work? Have we asked the player to press X to proceed? If so, did we ask in the right way, or did we accidentally make it a non-interactive interaction where it just forces you to press X to continue? Does the player feel like this is their narrative or not? And you know what? I think that we can do away with the concept of a linear narrative almost entirely. I think that this is just our desperate attempt to try and fit a linear narrative into a gaming environment where we say choices are what matter. And it's like, no, choices aren't what matter. Choosing is what matters. And even if the choosing is fake, it's still what matters, because that's the interaction. So in the past, I've said things like, the Paragon versus Renegade path is terrible because you just make one choice and then you just make that same choice throughout the whole game. But that is me making a choice. Even if it's the same choice every single time I make it, it's still me saying, please start the next part of this narrative. Now, it's not an open progression. I'm not walking through the dialogue trees, making choices wherever I want. It's forcing me to choose A or B or C or D. So it's not as good as something like press X to bake a cake. But it is still better than just having dialogue that endlessly progresses without me. Even if there's nothing useful for the player to do in terms of choosing between these options, just the fact that you do choose is enough to make the results feel more immersive. And that's true even if the dialogue is nonsense, even if there's no story. So, let's talk about Skyrim, because that's something I keep coming back to. But this is another good example of why this entire genre of games is so good. The reason that open world games are popular is because you choose a lot. You walk up to people a lot. You do whatever you want a lot. And that's really powerful. That's the interactive narrative that we're talking about. Now, one of the challenges is that when you are talking to people in Skyrim, they never really have anything interesting to say. So talking is really boring and stupid, and the only reason you ever talk to anybody is to advance a side quest of some kind or get a side quest of some kind. It's like, oh yeah, look, I'll talk to the guard and I'll just do nothing. But the other day, I robbed someone, and the guards caught me, and they said, "Halt, surrender, or we'll kill your ass." And it popped up a choice. And I said, hey, I usually don't get caught. I usually don't get seen. So it's been a long time since I've seen this. And you know what? I actually care. I actually am thinking about which way this dialogue should go. I'm actually considering, do I surrender? Do I bribe? Do I run away? What sort of option is best for me here? And a big part of that was the fact that this story was a continuation of a story I had created. This story was, I had opted into this thief lifestyle, and when the next story beat of this thief lifestyle was getting caught, yeah, I'll buy it. That's fine. I am ready for the next story beat because this is the next story beat in a story I have opted into. I have created this story. I have chosen this story. And so the next story element makes perfect sense. Whereas, when I'm baking a cake, my story element that I'm choosing is cake baking. And I think the next element in that cake baking story might be to serve the cake, or to rescue the cake when I burn it, or to hang up decorations for a party. But instead, the next beat of that story is a drunken dad who wanders in with a bat and starts beating up a little girl. That's not the same story. I didn't opt into that one. I don't want to play it. Therefore, it's written badly. No, but therefore I can complain about the writing because I'm not invested. This is something I really want to think in depth about. I have a lot of stuff I want to talk about this, but this is already a 20-minute video, so I should probably stop here with this basic idea. What is an interactive narrative? Well, I think it is a narrative where you choose the narrative. Not in terms of a branching path, but in terms of choosing to start the narrative at all. It's probably more complicated than that, but I think that'll do for starters. Let me know what you think, because this is just me getting started on the concept. I haven't thought about it enough to have really good opinions yet.